Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Tom Eddington. Jim Garrison has been away all week at a conference. Delighted to be hosting again day 5 of our conversations with my dear friend and colleague Carson Kelly and the folks from the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies. Great week, Carson. It's been such a mind-blowing experience, and delighted to have you back again today. And huge gratitude and thanks for helping put this week together. And looking forward to our time today with, and grateful that Leo, Nicco, and Felix have been able to come back to wrap up the week. So turn it over to you for introductions and opening remarks.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's been great to be here. And again, I'd like to, as I have probably not too many times, but not enough, thank Jim Garrison and the team at Humanity Rising for inviting us on to the podcast to share this work. I really appreciate this opportunity to bring forward some of my colleagues and the incredible work that they're doing in service of a more compassionate and flourishing world. And Tom, to you, thank you as well for your time and the opportunity you've created to invite us as well to join this effort. I'm very appreciative. My name is Carson Kelly, and I'm the founder of Compassion 2.0. Compassion 2.0 is a collection of professionals who are attempting to scale compassion through the intentional architecture of compassionate human experience that is both based on scientifically validated practices and interventions and can also be measured. We do this through the creation of compassionate and flourishing frameworks through both product development and organizational culture architecture. Community consists of organizational developers and leaders, product developers, neuroscientists, behavioral scientists, coaches, people professionals, UX, UI designers, entrepreneurs, VCs, and more. And you can learn about us and what we're doing at compassion2.com. So this week, we've taken a deep dive into the brilliant work of the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies, which we call IACS for short. For those who are joining just for today, IACS is an independent neuroscience lab in Santa Monica, founded by Dr. Nicco Reggente. From their About Us on their webpage, the statement is founded in 2019. The Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies is a 501c3 research laboratory using immersive experiential technology, neuromodulation, neurofeedback, and altered states to study consciousness. Specifically, our aim is to precisely capture, model, and provide an at-will instantiation of discrete states of consciousness that beget positive behavioral outcomes. Our current focus is on fostering meditative and entheogenic experiences. So this past week, we've had a number of the scientists with us. Today, we will be revisited, as Tom mentioned, by Dr. Nicco Reggente, again, who's the founder and principal investigator, along with his colleagues, Dr. Felix Scholler and Dr. Leonardo Christoph Moore, to discuss the importance of independent science, particularly in the consciousness space, as well as some of the future work that the lab is planning. So with that, I'd like to invite our friends from IACS to join us. Hey, Nicco.
Hey, Carson.
Hey, Felix.
Hey, Carson.
Hey, Leo. Thank you guys for being here. Also really appreciate, again, just to state that the scientists of the lab have taken a lot of time out of their schedule this week to do this, and not to mention getting started very early in the morning for those of us in the Pacific time zone here in the West Coast. So double points for that as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, thank you again. So today, this is a conversation that's really framed around the importance of independent science. For me personally, I have just such a respect and admiration and understand, I think at least, the deep imperative of consciousness science, the work that you guys are doing. Not to say that you're the only ones on the planet doing it, but you are doing incredible work, and the importance of that work, of course, far outlasts those of us that are currently embodied and walking around on the planet, and will also go to serve people who have yet to be born. So let's talk about that a little bit. So Nicco, obviously we should start with you, as you are the founder. So I'm curious to know, just some of the mechanics of the path. You spoke to it yesterday a bit in terms of your own personal path from PhD to, doing various work, and then Tiny Blue Dot, and then making the lab, et cetera. But for the listeners who aren't as familiar, myself included, with some of the mechanisms and the nuances of academic research versus non-academic research, and the funding and how that works and so forth, give us a sense, if you would, of again, your journey and or what it's like to set up and execute on an independent neuroscience lab.
Sure, yeah, and first, thank you, Carson and Tom and the whole Humanity Rising community for having us on and giving us a whole week in to be able to share some of our work with you guys and some of where we're headed in our direction. So really grateful for that. So let's see. I would be willing to wager that if you were to poll almost any graduate student in a PhD program at a university, what their plans are post-graduation, right? It's going to fall into probably two different categories, right? One is going into academia, right, and trying to identify like the peak there, right, which is a tenure track position, right? Being able to eventually get to a place where you're not constantly fighting for grants, et cetera. Your salary is, made and guaranteed, and you have a team of students working with you, and you can advance research in this, academic setting. Or, you'll go into industry and typically be doing something that's quite radically different than what you had done, but someone, or a corporation really values that, you have 3 letters after your name and that you're sophisticated and that you have some data science chops. That's at least the path that I've seen for a large number of people, and I'm sure Felix and Leo can speak to this with their cohort and classmates in their program as well. But the idea was, how is it possible that, at the peak of, academic study, right, following a PhD, that there's those two options for you, right? And one involves, right, going into academia is fantastic. I have so much love for academia, right? I mean, I'm still a professor at UCLA. I love academia. I like the idea that, you can have undergraduate students working in labs and learning and participating in studies for credit. And I love the whole ecosystem. However, it's academia tends to move at glacial speeds. And there's, for anything innovative and groundbreaking, especially like consciousness research, it tends to be a bit more of a slog. And a lot of the innovation tends to be micro-iterative on specific points that are geared towards getting funding, right? So a good example of that is in Alzheimer's research, right, where everybody, in order to get a grant in academia to look at Alzheimer's research, you had to be doing something around like beta amyloid plaque or tau tangles in proteins, right? And that's, every grant would kind of be judged as that's like the barometer for success of whether or not you could infiltrate that or impact that. And, now we kind of see that that's actually not the most terribly important thing. That's like, fixing one hole in a roof that has 30 holes in it. And, kind of prevented the development of more holistic, outside the box thinking that could, help solve all of those holes at once. And that's not, necessarily saying academia is bad. It's saying that it stifles some innovation at times because of this need to have this, a priori notion of hypothesis testing, and things need to kind of fit and be a natural extension of current work. So, combined with that general mentality, the idea that, most researchers then have to also become CEOs essentially of a lab, right? And, manage people and do HR and all these dynamics when, they made a great postdoc and they're fantastic researchers and thinkers, but they may not actually be ready to, manage a full lab like that. There's an interesting dynamic, right? Balancing all those things. Whereas then in industry, right? Like half of my cohort is doing nothing related to neuroscience, right? They're leveraging their data science chops, right? They're working, I don't know, everywhere from Meta to Google to Intuit, right? And they're not actually doing neuroscience. So it's like, well, the only way you can get through a PhD, right, is if you actually love the material. So it's like, there's a little bit of sadness in there baked in that you're kind of deviating from what you love and what fueled the purpose of getting the thing in the first place. So anyways, I know that's long-winded, but for
No, it's great.
people that don't, weren't ever in that position, it's hard to understand how there's been this long-standing itch, right, of academic and or scholars, right, and intellectuals that want to pursue this type of research and put in all the time and effort and energy that goes into it. So when I was also in this position, right, I thought to myself, why can't there be this third path, right? Something that kind of balances both, permits people to stay hyper focused and utilize their tools and skill sets to solve problems and do research and innovate in ways that can be, more of the startup mentality, fail fast, innovate, pivot, change, think outside the box, think with a more, and Felix can speak to this as well, but think with a more engineering mind, right? How do we deploy tools that solve problems now, right? How can we have that mindset instead of constantly iterating on something with small nuanced changes that may actually not have broad appeal? So I had a lot of background in startups. I had a few startups, and I've always had an entrepreneurial nature. So I thought, okay, this is a cool opportunity to start blending those things. So I was actually working with Tiny Blue Dot Foundation at the time as their project officer. And, it kind of permitted me this interesting opportunity to propose the idea of starting a nonprofit research institute that can be, hyper dedicated on answering questions around consciousness from a pure standpoint, right? Meaning, facing everything from what's been dubbed the hard problem to actually like applications of consciousness research. So it's an amazing opportunity to do that. So we took it, and essentially now we've been operating as this nonprofit that kind of treads the line, or takes the best of both worlds of like academic rigor, right? Employing all of the same rigor, if not more, in our experimental designs and our data analysis protocols, and publishing in high impact peer-reviewed journals, right? Our team is getting quite decorated now, and combining that with the flexibility and nimbleness and prudence of startup culture. So it's been a really cool environment, in my opinion. And while we suffer from needing to find funding and having periods of lots of heavy work and stress, there it does cultivate a different culture as well, right? So that's another important thing, and I'll let Felix and Leo speak to that because it's probably better from their perspective because it's something they joined and now have been helping me build into the next stage. But it creates a different culture where you're not constantly you're not doing a more 9 to 5 work as you would in industry, and you're not, constantly being pulled on 101 different committees in academia, where really, all of the work that's being done here is, I use like a agile project management strategy where everybody, that's working on the team, we have clearly defined monthly objectives that get then broken down into weekly meetings and goals. And there's a clearly defined scope of work. There's, JIRA tickets attached to it. It's all well outlined. And we have a stand-ups channel, right? So it's very reminiscent of like a tech startup. But it's great because, it lets us be more flexible because all that we care about is, did the work get done this week that we were focused on? And if that took you, half a day on a Friday morning, great. Like that's a testament to your skill and how efficient of a worker you can be. If you can pump out that much value in half a day, I'm happy, like, to, go be. So, I think it permits for a little bit more innovation as well and doesn't stifle creativity and permits for people to kind of work at their leisure, right? And I think Leo and I are a good dynamic of that. We kind of have like a day shift and a night shift, Mr. Vampire over there. And like Leo will work from a climbing gym, right? He'll go like, yeah, I'll let him speak to that. But like, I like the idea that we can foster a more creative environment that permits for the lived experience that we know so much in neuroscience and from the findings, right? We're trying to actually live in accordance with proceedings, right? Like listen to the data. You're much more productive with diverse working environments with a 4-day work week, right? Mixing exercise and sunshine and nature exposure into it. And we try and really embed that into the lab culture. So anyway, it's very much so an experiment, IACS, but we've been going strong now for about 4 years. And yeah, it's a real honor to be able to scratch this long-term itch. So that's my spiel. And I think Felix and Leo can add immensely to that because they've been at different organizations, or Felix around the world and Leo as well. So they can characterize and contextualize it a bit more too.
Yeah, maybe when Leo and Felix in particular, when you respond to Carson's question, I've worked with over the decades with organizations like the Applied Physics Laboratory and some of the major research institutions. I've got a client that's one of the top basic research institutes in the world. I've worked in the academic setting with some of the leading academic institutions. And what I'm hearing with what you just shared, Nicco, is that, I mean, from my experience, most researchers, most scientists are not interested in doing the grant writing and having to go out and find their funding. It's a unique individual that can accept that responsibility of taking on the grant writing and finding funding for the research, which is what was their heart song. And I'd love to hear how you've baked that into your recruiting process and how you've baked that into your the people working in the work you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good point. And a lot of grant writing, et cetera, is a bureaucratic nightmare, right? Like if you've ever tried to submit an NIH or an NSF grant, you're doing more like repeating yourself and rephrasing and filling out forms and stuff than you are pitching ideas, right? Like it would be much better if you could just, submit a one-pager, let them evaluate, and then invite you back for something for a more full proposal. Because it's such a time sink. I can't it's 80 plus hours to just do the paperwork side, let alone the scientific thinking around it. So you're right. It does. Sorry,
I was going to say, knowing that you put those 80 hours in, and you've got a 10% at best chance of actually getting the
grant. 10% sounds great. It's more like a 3% max. And a lot of times it's I mean the whole thing is broken. We can get into that a little later, but it does take a certain resolve of a scientist to be able to digest that pill and keep waking up and powering through and doing it. But then also, there's other funding agencies that are opened up to us where we can have a little bit different of a dynamic where we can share a general idea we're interested in and see where the convergence is with that funding body and start to develop something together. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it does take a certain person and it really takes a certain passion in an individual where you truly feel as though this work is incredibly important, which I think, the three of us all feel here. We're trying to focus our work on bringing about solutions and experiential technologies that can serve as a rising tide that lifts all our collective ships in the humanity harbor, right? Mm-hmm. So that instills in you a certain fortitude and discipline that, sure, it's a lot of work, but we just wipe our brows, right? And move forward because our eye is on the prize. Like we're aiming for the mountain, so everything kind of in the in-between is noise, and we're willing to cut through it and keep sharpening our sword accordingly. So yeah, it definitely takes a certain type of person, but I would make the testament actually the locus of focus more so on the passion that person has. That's really the driver.
Fascinating. I'd like to jump in. I know that Felix and Leo will have some things to say about the culture. But before we move there, I'd like to unpack just a little bit further some of the nuance around the grants, or rather the funding in the academic context when you were talking about the Alzheimer's research as an example. And what's fascinating to me, for those of us that have read Thomas Kuhn and the Structure of Scientific Revolution, the notion that the funding is tied to a certain intellectual framework that's reinforced by senior academic leadership, be it professors or what have you, and that in order to enter into that field, field is not the right term, but in order to participate in that conversation of research, to your earlier point, you have to somewhat have already accepted an intellectual framework that may or may not be right and fundamentally goes against the notion of good science, as I understand it, not being a scientist. So that seems to then perpetuate potentially erroneous framing for years until someone really can stand forward and say, hey, no, actually, all of this makes no sense. And, or it's been a good idea, but here's a better one. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes this interesting, self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts where, I remember quite distinctly with some of my advisors in grad school, when you get a host of results, right, from the whole point of empiricism is to, do good, rigorous methodology and practice empiricism, look at the data and try and interpret it as it is. And there was always this underlying kind of doubt about novel findings, right? Like, oh, well, that I've never seen that before in the literature. Like, we must have done something wrong. And to me, it's like, well, what about the first people that ever saw things? Like they didn't have anything to compare to. Like, why are we looking at things through a framework where this doesn't make sense? Can't we trust the methodology, right? That's the whole beauty of science, is if you successfully employ the method, you can trust, right, some of the data and turn that, data into information that you can access. So that's always been, yeah, it's a big pain point, right? It's similar to echo chambers, right? In some senses. That's not to say that there's not a host of breakthroughs every single day coming out of academia, right?
Of course.
But it is interesting, right? And then it requires certain positions and certain, rebellions to happen in order to break out of that. So, for instance, right, I had this idea to do some like prognostic neuroimaging, meaning like using machine learning to look at someone's brain when they're, just at rest, and then try and predict 4 weeks into the future how that person was going to respond to cognitive behavioral therapy. Seems like, fortune telling or kind of far out there. And I kind of proposed this idea, and many in my circle, especially my seniors, like kind of laughed at me. They were like, you really think you can like predict how someone's going to respond to the brain while they're just laying in a scanner? And I was like, yeah, I kind of do think that. Right? That sounds kind of reasonable to me. They're like, okay, whatever. So, I'm not going to be able to, I wasn't able to receive any funding to do that work, but I was just like stubborn. And I was just like, I'm going to do it. And I got the data and I did it in my free time, and I built this pipeline, and turns out it was very correct, right? We were able to account for a large swath of the variance, right? Looking into the future, which is a very meaningful thing, right? You're able to tell someone an outcome likelihood of them succeeding in a particular avenue of treatment, be it pharmacological or cognitive behavioral therapy. And that saves them a lot of time, money, and energy. And, we put out a really high impact publication. It got a lot of press. People were hitting me up from all different angles, being like, oh, can you put my kid through this? Like, I want tools, like, et cetera. And I was immediately not allowed to do any of that, of course, because, yeah, it's a whole thing. But it was fascinating, right? And then now that's kind of sparked a whole field. Like, there's a whole host of people at different institutes doing prognostic neuroimaging because it's very cool. It lets you, A, just get that data out, but then B, also try and understand the mechanisms present there that are accounting for that variance, and let us actually mechanistically start to pin down the neural correlates of a host of different transformative behaviors. So, but it took that very specific kind of attitude, right? Where I was just like, no. Like, I don't care. I'll do it on the weekends or something, right? And just figure it out myself because I'm interested in this and there's opportunity. And fortunately, there were enough open-minded enough people to be able to put the data in my hands, right? And do the work, which I'm enormously grateful for. But, like, what if I had just been like, oh yeah, you guys are right. That's a silly idea, right? Then probably somebody would have done it eventually, right? But who knows how many like ideas like that are stifled by this, like you phrased it very well, Carson, like this self-perpetuating framework.
Well, I think the other side of that too is, first off, well done. Good to be stubborn. Awesome. But then on the other side, the other model is, to your point, is the commercial model where the ends only justify the means. So I'm curious to know too, just in terms of, maybe experience from your friends or what have you, just how does that show up in terms of the work, in terms of the scientific inquiry? I mean, I make assumptions that if I'm working for Megacorp has their own commercial interests at the end of the day, and everything that falls in line must justify any expenditure to those interests. So I'm curious again to know just, if you could unpack that in terms of what you've experienced yourself and or what your colleagues have.
Sure, yeah, and I think, I'm sure Leo and Felix have seen this as well, but you go from being in a graduate student position, right, where if you're lucky, right, you're making like 36K a year, right, especially in LA, which is,
Right.
Basically below the poverty line, right? And then someone offers you, a 220K salary a year. But, I'm going to do you're going to take that and do what they say and, use the methods that you've learned. But, you can kind of throw, the science out the window, right? Because there's that juxtaposition of, going from complete scarcity to abundance that is so attractive that it kind of loosens perspective on what got you into this in the first place. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I know a lot of people that got turned off to, one of my really good friends wanted to go to grad school for psychology, and she got turned off from an advisor saying like, oh, everybody that goes into psychology, they just go into marketing after. And, they just learn the tricks about the human mind and how to increase engagement. And then they go and employ that into, all of the tech that's, currently keeping us enslaved to our devices, right? So that's a big turnoff for her. And she didn't even go into and pursue it in the first place. But then it's like kind of once you're in it, right? And then you want to get paid, right, and survive. It's easier to kind of make that sacrifice or make that leap. I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but it's a symptom of of an underlying disease when some of the better minds of our times are being kind of pigeonholed into this like capitalism run amok model, right? But I would love to hear from Felix and Leo on
Me too.
on that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Either of you guys or both.
Felix, want to go for it?
No, yeah, go for it. I love listening to you talk.
Same.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of benefits to this third path. I mean, and some of them, the thing is, if I'm directing like a compassionate eye towards some of these other forms of endeavor, like the private sector or academia, like I don't think a lot of these patterns that can stifle innovation or force you to focus on instrumental goals rather than ultimate goals is like the fault of any particular mustache twirling evil person. It's like it's the nature of the structures themselves and their incentives. So it's just the very fact that we're smaller, just that there's less of a administrative structure above Nicco, basically.
Right.
Just overlooking what we're doing. Just that means that, like, yes, it does mean that you have to, our allies and the people we publish with and our granting agencies have to trust us more, but that's fine. We have benchmarks by which to earn that trust. We pre-register all our studies, everything's IRB approved, everything's by the book, everything's done to the best standards while we publish in the best journals, but also gives us this leanness to pursue any question that we consider pertinent and do it in a really fast and flexible fashion. And that's the reason why, we just last year alone, we published like 20 papers, and not in just random journals, in real journals, PNAS, Science, Nature. That's I think in large part just because of the leanness of our structure. For all intents and purposes, the buck stops with Nicco, who's like one of my oldest friends and colleagues. It's not like this giant overlord type thing. It's just like, hey, hey dude, after we go climbing, you want to talk about some other cool studies we could do? It's like, yeah, that sounds great. It's like we have this very loose, open-minded thing, and all that really matters, the benchmark is, how much does a given new idea, will it divert us so much from existing work that it undermines existing work? If not, no big deal. Let's check it out. And is it something that we can pursue with adequate rigor? And that's it. That's the only benchmark by which we pursue a novel line of research. Is like, can we accommodate it? Can we get it funded? And can we do it rigorously? And I think that allows for we're able to pursue questions on the fly that arise from research, and this happens all the time in the lab, where we'll read a paper, we'll all get excited about it and go like, oh, that gives me an idea for a study. And like a week later, we have a 2-pager written up for the study. We throw it in the quiver so we can have it ready whenever we need to apply for funding. Where we can pre-register that same study idea within a month, and then run the study, especially if it's like an online survey study, which is the way we get a lot of our studies like started and get some, wind under our sails. We can run that, 1 or 2 months later. So from ideation to results, you're talking about like 1 to 3 months frequently. And that's insane from the perspective of any kind of research laboratory or private sector thing. And I think, and from the other perspective, like contrasting us with the private sector, because we are ultimately focused on ultimate goals and values rather than just quarterly earnings, which has its own benefits. That's why so much of these entities around the world are so self-sustaining and they're innovative, et cetera. But I think there is an extent to which doing good science means you go step by step by step, right? And you do things that are sustaining, et cetera. But great science involves taking these big leaps of intuition and sometimes pursuing something for which there is currently no return on investment, et cetera, because the boons down the line to knowledge and then downstream return on investment for other people in many fashions is going to be huge. And so we're able to also do that. We can pursue stuff that follows what we ultimately think is interesting without focusing so much on like, yeah, but will it pay in next quarter or the next quarter? We don't have to worry about that either. So there's just all these things we don't have to worry about. And at the end of the day, it's just, do we trust ourselves and do our allies trust us in terms of scientists? And what keeps us honest again in that regard is the benchmarks by which we do our research, and our philanthropic allies, our allies like yourself, Carson, and our allies within academia. Because if anything vouches for the fact that we're trying to do things right and that people like what we're doing, is that we have allies all over academia. There are very high-level professors and administrators in the best universities who vouch for us, and they vouch for us regularly. And they send us people to be interns here. We have more people than we can accommodate trying to come work here and volunteer at the Institute. We get some of that, and we're currently, we had a meeting earlier this week with like a crop of some of the most talented young neuroscientists probably in the country. People from Brown, from Harvard, they come to us because it's very much a model of how things can be. And I think even people within academia see that. There's no small amount of not envy, but certainly just like, wow, that sounds nice when we talk to people in other sectors about how we get to do things. Yeah, so that's my view of it. I think it's very much it's a structural thing. It's not like there's something that great about us in particular. It's just the structure of this.
I'd argue that, but yes, the structure itself is the problem. Just to jump in, if I may, Felix, did you want to add anything? Because I actually have a couple of things I wanted to throw out there.
Just quickly, maybe. So if we gain a little bit in abstraction, I think what's really at stake is the dialectics between truth and power.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
A lot of that, I think, has to do also with the question of how scientists can capture the value that they create, which, within both an academic or industrial setting is impossible. And I think really, what's different about the Institute, and that's most likely due to the fact that it's very early stage, but hopefully will remain that way, is that as Leo mentioned and Nicco also sort of introduced, we don't have to deal with this sort of power dynamics that you see within universities or companies, because especially in today's world where they take all sorts of forms. and so we can, concentrate on the work and try to figure out the truth about the universe and the human mind and so on. So I think if we want to elevate a bit and gain some abstraction, we can. That's where we can talk about things like the big question is how to capture the value of the truth that you can uncover about the world. And the way this is done in universities is typically through, research articles that, feed into the prestige of the university, which are very much like trust funds, right? That hire research scientists to produce this prestige that then allows the university to survive through its endowment fund and basically make money on the back of scientists who will produce these ideas and experiments to validate them within, as you mentioned, like some well-defined scientific framework that has, both its limitations and like that offers both a foundation and a roof for what is possible. And then within industry, it's as Leo mentioned, very much a question of quarterly earnings and funding and how much money can you make with that finding. Which and I think we're in the middle ground where we can be focused on more long-term goal without having to sort of persuade administrator that the work is done in a way. And I think a lot of that, a lot of the success that we get from this really, speaks to, Nicco's commitment to doing good science. I think if it were to be a different founder and director, it would be very different, where, Nicco truly has like a discipline and respect for truth itself, which, you don't find in every individual, especially when, money is involved and so on.
Absolutely, 100%.
It's fascinating for me because we've had the good fortune to spend time with you guys talking about this, as I mentioned earlier. But this conversation, I think, is really clarifying things for me further around the third path concept. At the end of the day, just to reiterate a lot of what Leo was saying, and Felix, what you were just speaking to, it does come down to the question of who has to trust who in order to execute. And on the one hand, so to your point, Felix, is it the academics that are trusting people who then the academics provide the funds to be able to do that work? So do they have to be, gain the trust? Do the grant giving organizations have to do it? Do the companies, the corporations, in terms of their own immediate goals and financial concerns that they have, can they trust? And I think the model that I'd like to continue to try to help support IACS develop is to actually just allow the scientists, namely you guys and others, the trust itself needs to come from the rigor of the science, which is what Leo and Felix are speaking to about how Nicco's approach is. The science is the only thing that needs to demand the trust. And that comes through peer review and the processes by which you guys are already working to those standards. And then the funding has to come out of the trust equation at one level. The funding has to just trust you guys and the science that you follow. And it's that simple. And not just you, just as a model, broadly speaking, I think for other independent scientists. There's a person that's speaking about some work that he's been doing on aging in the chat here. And it's this sort of model, I think, needs to be developed and made available, because the work, I love that, in humanity's harbor, in the sense of raising all of the boats involved, is the goal, and the trust for the work and the funding source. That's its end in and of itself, ultimately. So again, community supported science, as I'm calling it, is, I think, an incredible model and need for the future. Does that land with you guys?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Tom, anything for you right now, or?
Yeah, I'm just, listening to this conversation. I'm going to go back 3 or 4 decades when I was working with a number of pharmaceutical companies, and at that time, 5% of their annual budget was dedicated to R&D. And it allowed the scientists to be working for a pharmaceutical company, spend their whole career with the hope that maybe they might have some kind of breakthrough, creating some kind of compound. And because of the regulatory environment, because of the cost of the research, for a variety of reasons, the pharmaceutical companies found that it was cheaper for them to stop investing in R&D and put that money into mergers and acquisitions budget and go out and find small startups that had created a compound, that had done something. And they effectively shifted from being an R&D focused organization to marketing companies with the ability to just focus on, acquiring the knowledge, acquiring the inventions. And we've seen other industries that have done the same thing for commercial reasons. And so it's just widened the gap between what's being done at basic research level within an academic setting, and increasingly it's being done by the institutions that have a large endowment, that can afford the time, and it's widened the gap between the commercial organizations and academic institutions. So what you guys have done is you've attempted to fill that gap as a model that is necessary across all sectors of basic research. And so, I applaud you for what you're trying to do, because that gap is widening, and it's got to get filled somehow. I referenced in the chat the Buck Institute and the work they're doing. They happen to have a very large endowment that they can focus on aging, but there are very few organizations out there that can fill this ever increasing gap between the federal government money is drying up, and the commercial industry is their funding is drying up. So the gap is growing, and it's got to get filled somehow. And so I just want to applaud what you guys are doing.
And to add to that too, if I may, I think the extra wrinkle, so to speak, on this for me is the fact that the work that IACS is doing, not to say that what other scientists are doing isn't important by any means. Of course it is. Medicines and all kinds of breakthroughs and things that alleviate suffering at scale is incredibly important. And what IACS is doing at the forefront of consciousness studies becomes even more esoteric, even more, maybe less immediately commercially applicable that people can immediately identify, although the applicability of with the research that's coming out of the lab is phenomenal and huge. But it's not, it is, it's so different in the sense of it's around consciousness, psychedelics, and all kinds of other things that you guys are working on that I think exasperates the problem. And to me, also continues to point that as a society, when we stand back and we think about the kinds of things that people do in society and how we reward them, where does consciousness science and its importance sit with that? For instance, one of the stats that I saw recently, and I do enjoy watching him play, but Ronaldo, the very famous footballer, I think made $200 million last year, something of that scale.
Good Lord.
That's a lot of money for a year of, playing football on the pitch. Again, enjoyable to watch. He's an incredible athlete. But what does that say to us as a society? What does that say to us as a group? And then when we stand back and say, well, we're stifling some level of science that doesn't fall into these other buckets of, again, academic framework, which is kind of a perpetuity of some level of institutional knowledge, and not institutional knowledge, but knowledge that's structured, and or the commercial applications where brilliant people are, learning how to make Facebook more sticky. And I'm not trying to I'm sounding very snarky, and I apologize. That's not my intention. But in terms of the work that you guys are doing, there has to be, I think, a greater awareness to every citizen, anybody who's listening to this podcast, for instance, to understand that it's up to us to figure out how to provide opportunities for the thinkers in this example at IACS to be able to just do their thing and be able to explore the subjects that they want to explore. So I'll get off my
Just
soapbox for a moment.
Just to amplify your comments, Carson, from my perspective, the biggest challenge that humanity faces is we've got to move from our adolescent stage of development and evolve to adulthood.
Yeah.
And that's only going to come through shifting our consciousness, evolving our consciousness, which is at the heart of what you guys are doing. If we can solve that, if we can move humanity from adolescence to adulthood, we can solve all of the problems that humanity is facing on this planet. And so I would argue that the work you three are doing and your institute is doing is at the heart of what it's going to require for humanity to continue to exist as a species.
Yeah, and
sorry.
Yeah, I mean, to Leo's point and Carson's, I just wanted to add that, it really is it requires like a cultural shift to prioritize those things. It seems as though the priority is more so on, the bread and circus, right? You see Ronaldo getting paid that type of dollars because he brings in more than that, right?
That's exactly right.
Or, I kind of always relate it to the Fast and the Furious series, right? Which, is sometimes a guilty pleasure, kind of like, hilarious, but it's like, okay, just take a quick step back. The Fast and Furious 10 budget was $340 million, right? And do we need another Fast and Furious? Maybe we could skip one, right? Because think about the type of damage we could do with $340 million in, applying it to science like this, that's, trying to isolate the fulcrum to help promote, lifting up human flourishing, right? If we spent, a fraction of that, but what's interesting, right, is that, it's part of capitalism run amok, right? Where you kind of, I think it was Ludacris. I saw an interesting video with him where they're just like, why do you guys keep making these things? Like, why do we need Fast and Furious 13? Da, da, da. And he's like, what don't you get? Like, we spend 350 million and we make 700 million. Like, why would you stop making that? And if your focus is on, creating entertainment, which is, incredibly important, right? But it's like this reallocation of potential funding, right? Where it's like $340 million, you could do a lot of damage with that. Granted, it needs to be coming from a different sector, right? It needs to be government
$3 million you could do a lot, let alone the 300. Like,
yeah, exactly. But sorry, yeah, I know Felix, you were going to make a point too. I just wanted to.
Yeah, well, just speaking to that point, I mean, and especially in the context of the question of compassion. The majority of the funding for research and development in the US mostly goes to the army and the development of weapons or system of defenses, and the best breakthrough of which remain secret and out of public, which is in a fundamental way sort of antagonistic to the principle of science as a collaborative endeavor in the first place. So I think that's something worth thinking about. And I personally like I think it's a very interesting context also, the army, for producing knowledge and science, because it has this applied dimension and also speaks to this interesting paradox of the relationship between truth and power, where the army may be the most hierarchically rigid structure that ever is, but as a matter of fact, it produces much better science than a lot of sort of open and loose cultures, because it has this sort of applied dimension, which I personally think as a scientist is essential. But I wanted to piggyback on what Tom was saying, that if consciousness is indeed the thing that got the ape down the tree, then I think it's worth asking the question of what the next stages of that process will look like, and the benefits or risks that it may pose for mankind when looking at our evolution as a species. And probably technology is bound to play an important role in that, sort of in the next steps of that process. And a lot of people, are talking about this in the context of artificial general intelligence, which I personally think may not be it is hard. It is a combination of words that are each individually very hard to define. But I don't know, maybe Leo can speak to some of these questions with the work they're doing on prosociality and artificial intelligence. So there is a tremendous responsibility in terms of the work we're doing. I think it's also, yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I was just like, had these ideas.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing them. The point about the army is very interesting. And
it's like paradox between freedom and structure. And there's a lot of these paradoxes in science too, right? You need axioms in order to be able to do mathematics, but then you're fundamentally constrained by them. And it's there's all these paradoxes that are hard to circle around.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to the funding question, part of the work, the meta kind of work that I think we're doing is also fleshing out a bit of and partly building, the funding ecosystem that can allow for some, small nonprofit institutes like ours to exist. Because it's not just that we want everyone who's interested in this to come have a job here, because there's more amazing talent in the world that we could even accommodate as much as we want to have everybody. It's that, like, we want to make the path easier for other people to do this as well. We want there to be whole networks of institutes like ours all over the world, sharing knowledge and sharing these kind of same values. And building out that funding ecosystem is challenging, but I mean, clearly there's interest and resources. And on the other hand, there's people like, there are groups like us, and we're trying to make that easier. I mean, one of the many avenues by which that's occurring is this really cool model that Nicco's been pioneering of trying to figure out, can we crowdsource research, basically. We currently have a study aimed at using ultrasound to directly target the pineal gland, not because we have any defined beliefs one way or another about its, supernatural function or its lack thereof. It's just there aren't data points. No one's done it thus far. And there isn't currently an existing, traditional funding body that would particularly want to do that, but we still think it's of interest. And we think a lot of people think it's of interest. So we're literally crowdfunding the study, and it's currently, I think, 25% funded, which is, we need more than that to get it done. But just that alone is amazing. And, that's something I'm sure we'll share here with the audience as well. But I think that's a model that could be really powerful in the future, the more people know about it, that, individual citizens can contribute $5 or $10 alone to make amazing research happen that they know that they're part of. They can see the outcomes. It becomes part of public knowledge and helps sort of human flourishing. And we welcome, advice and insights on how to keep expanding these unorthodox funding models to make it so we can, more and more focus on the science. Yeah.
Yeah, something that it's not crowdfunding per se, but in the Lyme disease community, they created a platform where every individual patient can enter their Lyme data into the platform. So it's called My Lyme Data. So it's crowdfunding the data as opposed to crowdfunding the funding of the research. And it's a very novel approach to get a tremendous amount of data very, very cost effectively. And it's advanced the research significantly over the last 10 years.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's a great example.
It's very cool.
Technology platforms that are out there now are enabling very innovative ways to do research and to answer big questions.
Yeah. I mean, that's something we talked a lot about in the Institute, is that there's so much data out there to be mined that's just staying there, holding answers to many profound questions. And what's needed is the infrastructure to be able to structure them in a standardized way that it can then be amenable to mathematical analysis.
Yeah, I think about that all the time, the degree to which there's a bunch of water data out there that we want to turn into the wine of information, right? Like it's out there, we're just not leveraging it appropriately, right? And that but we are in ways where it serves us capitalistically, right? Like you
Right.
look, why is it I can go on Netflix, right, and see an outcome likelihood of me enjoying that movie, right? It's going to be 80% likelihood that I'm going to give that a thumbs up. Well, what about, trying to predict whether or not I'm going to respond to a particular treatment or whether this neurofeedback protocol is for me, or any host of other things where we're, taking into consideration the person that has a disease over the disease that the person has, right? Going back to like Hippocrates. Um, yeah, so it's really, I wouldn't say it's unfortunate. I think it's just underutilized and unmined, and the perspective gets a little lost on things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another like in that direction, same direction, another one of the cool sort of, I think, unorthodox research directions that we're pursuing that we'll probably be able to talk about in more detail in like, the year or years to come, is in partnerships with other entities like Sensoria, who are interested in sort of democratizing consciousness research and make it easier for individual people outside of the laboratory setting to give comprehensive, laboratory grade, IRB approvable, publishable personal data on their non-ordinary conscious experiences using a simple, app interface, for example, so that we can grow a network of psychonauts, right, basically worldwide, who can report on their individual adventures through all the different non-ordinary states that human consciousness offers and contribute to, to general knowledge. And so those are also tools that we'll hope to share through this and other networks, to increase that amount of type of data so that it's not just harnessed towards selling you a better shirt or something, right? But towards advancing our understanding of all the varieties of conscious experience. So
Yeah, that's a great point, Leo, because
Really good point.
in you look at traditional academic settings or any traditional like rigorous, even if we had to do it here, right, a setting of trying to study something like altered states induced by psychedelics, right? You start to remove some of the very important ecological context of a trip report, right? If you take someone and, we've gotten some insights into how they do a lot of these studies, right? You take someone and you give them psilocybin and put them in a sterile room with kind of like no environmental enrichment, and then you try and study the effects of that in this, fill out these surveys. It's like, whoa, have you ever had a psychedelic journey? Like that's not the trip to have, So, it's interesting because it's both a pain point, but also our greatest strength in that almost everybody is an expert on consciousness, right? That gets to people's heads sometimes, and they try and talk with lingo that is maybe outside the scope of understanding. But everybody is an expert on their own consciousness in a certain way, right? Whether or not your phenomenology is more obfuscated to you, right? You can report on things and you have experiences, and there's how many billions of us, and the degree to which we can start meeting people where they are with technology that we're working on with Sensoria, and saying, well, wow, we can, well, how many people are gonna, take a tab of acid today on, June 7th around the world? You can collect like 100 different clinical trials in an hour, right? If you do this more distributed system and put some guide rails for people to provide you with data that is trustable. So yeah, it's a really strong point, Leo, and I hope that we start moving a bit more in that direction. Like, stop trying to put things into boxes that are defined by their box breaking promotion of behavior. So yeah, I love that point, and I really love what Sensory is doing as well.
Yeah, they're doing some really cool stuff. Go ahead, Felix.
I think it goes even deeper because consciousness is what produces the science in the first place. So any sort of real breakthrough in the science of consciousness is bound to have fundamental consequences for the scientific process itself, to the extent that it is consciousness that's producing the science. So if we were to have like a fundamental breakthrough in consciousness science, it would probably have consequences on the scientific method itself.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of unpredictable effects that could arise from progresses in that field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hey, there's it's interesting because Yeah, it does require some, guidance at first because, if you look at, for instance, what's going on in like the pineal gland's a good example, right? Where people still are attributing it to be the first instrument of the soul, the seat of consciousness, where DMT is produced and, how we enter all these altered states, and that's like the locus of control for these things. And it's like, we don't know that, right? And that's just a lot of like information being passed around people. And, it's like a game of telephone, right? Where the message is getting distorted over and over again. And then, you also then have a host of individuals that are having certain experiences, and precluded from their awareness are certain, common cognitive distortions and, perceptual tricks or, you know, things that they're buying into that's precluding them from actually truth seeking any longer, right? Becomes this interesting self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's where there's some where things kind of start going awry, right? Is where people think that they're an expert on the philosophy of mind and consciousness studies. And then they start speaking with authority towards the mechanisms underpinning those things. And then everybody else that's looking at that from a side throws the baby out with the bathwater, right? And starts to disregard the potential insights that could be fostered with that type of framework that just kind of get distorted based on people who are not uh haven't achieved the knowledge to be self-observing of their own logical fallacies, right? And so but I think if we could, if we included logic and like scientific process into the reading, writing, arithmetic at like a young age, then we could foster more and more minds that are not subject to those fallacies and can be doing this like crowdsourced, phenomenological research.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in real quick. I have another commitment and need to say goodbye. But before I do, I just want to say just a huge thank you, Nicco, Leo, Felix, for being with us today and this week, and all of the support in making this week such an incredible conversation. Big thank you to you, Carson, for pulling it all together. I will be joining and moderating next week. We've got a conversation on the future of God, and look forward to seeing the Humanity Rising audience next week for another week of programming while Jim is in Mexico. So thanks for having me along the journey this week.
Well, thank you, Tom. As always, your voice is always so fascinating in the sense of your perspective and background. So it's great. And I'll stay with these guys for a little bit longer. I want to talk a little bit more about the pineal gland, and next week you can talk about God.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Tom.
Tom.
It was very nice to meet you.
Great to meet you, Tom.
So just in the interest of time, just because again, we could do this all day long. Could we come back to the pineal gland and talk a little bit about that? Leo, of course, brought that forward about as a current crowdsourced funding model to get that research off the ground, which is awesome. And just tell us a little bit about the kinds of things that you're thinking about, or the kinds of questions that you want to explore and your assumptions. For those of you that are interested, you should definitely take a look at the presentation that's available on their IACS website that talks about the research. But Nicco, if you could, or Leo, or Felix, if you could speak to it.
Yeah, I can speak a bit to it. So, the pineal gland research is a very interesting interface, right? Because on one side, you have this host of, ancient wisdom and modern lore that have positioned the pineal gland as, as I was saying before, this first instrument of the soul, like where, the non-divided the seat of consciousness is, right? And some of that goes back to, ancient Egypt, showing like the eye of Horus, right? Kind of looks like a sagittal slice through the brain, focused on the pineal gland as like this eye, this third eye concept. And then you also have, a host of different symbols, right? Like pine cones and Vatican imagery, right? There's a lot of these interesting allusions to it. And then you also have, people like, Joe Dispenza, who are doing these pineal gland activation meditations, and people are paying thousands and thousands of dollars to go to these retreats and do these pineal gland activations, which that's not a snub or any hate. It's I think it's an amazing experience that people are gathering in en masse and doing these and having these very valid experiences that are transformative for them. Where I take some issue is placing stock at the locus of and giving out confidence about the locus of the mechanism responsible for those very valid experiences that people have, right? Because on the other side, right, if you ask most academics about the pineal gland, it's almost like some career suicide. They look at it like, oh, that's, super like new age woo-woo stuff. Like, you're not taking it seriously. All that it's doing is, outputting secreting melatonin into the bloodstream, and it's a circadian rhythm regulating gland. And that's true, but partially true, right? There's this, the problem though is that then that, as we were talking before, right, that construct of looking at things from this prescribed realm of, oh, we're going to put the pineal gland in a box. We already know everything there is to know about it, right? And there's nothing else. Then you kind of put a stop sign on the scientific progress in that domain, and there's been so little research because of that in modern science using all of our sophisticated methods. There's a dearth of research on the pineal gland right now, right? And that's because the other side, the popular media, has been, lauding it as this, the seat of a third eye. So then no one wants to touch it in academia, which is, sad, because in my opinion, let's just put some data on the table. Like, let's take a rigorous scientific approach and just let the data speak for itself, right? But most people are not in a position to do that. So fortunately, we think that we're kind of particularly positioned to do something exactly like that, right? So we have this idea to neuromodulate the pineal gland and see if there are any changes in phenomenological behavior. If it is, which I don't personally believe it to be, but if it is this seat of consciousness, I think that that's a misunderstanding of consciousness. But if there is something in the pineal gland that helps to mediate the mystical experience and does provide a sense of internal seeing through this third eye, which there are a host of very interesting peculiar properties about the pineal gland, right? It's very well positioned to the ventricles and the blood-brain barrier. It has crystalline structures inside of the pineal gland, which is not found anywhere else in the brain except for inside the inner ear, that helps with balance. There are derivatives ancestrally of photoreceptor cells in the pineal gland that, who knows, could be used to be, sensitive to internal biophoton emissions from mitochondria, which is a well now known studied process. So there could be some insights there. I don't know, right? But either does science at this point. So, we came up with this idea to, well, what if and then a lot of this was actually spearheaded by one of our junior scientists, Jezebel, well, why don't we just put some data on the table? We have this way to neuromodulate basically anywhere in the brain with low intensity focused ultrasound. And we have this region that nobody's been touching. Well, what if we just neuromodulate it? Let's poke the bear a little bit and see, right? Is there any type of reliable evocation of a mystical state, or do people just get tired because we're disrupting their melatonin? I don't know, but I'd be very curious to see. And I would take a, very pre-registered, formalized approach with a sham design, right? And ask the right questions, get the right reports, and just observe, right? I think it's a shame that there's maybe there's some signal there, right? If everybody's talking about it in some capacity, it doesn't necessitate that there's a signal there, but there could be. It might be worthy of investigation. So let's see, right? Let's put some data on the table. So we want to run the world's first neuromodulation of the pineal gland study, and we think that it's a provocative enough idea that threads that needle between sophistication and potential exploration of opening your third eye, that we're taking this crowdfunding approach to it, right? Where people can go on and give, you know, anywhere from $5,000 to $1,000+ to support this research. And we have, you know, very clearly outlined where each donation goes, how much it'll cost us to run a participant, what happens if you donate, et cetera. So we have a whole thing set up for it that makes it feel a little bit more like a Kickstarter and really more like community science, right? No funding agency is going to fund that research that I just pitched, right? But I think enough people are interested and have heard enough about the pineal gland and, you know, have maybe done a pineal gland activation where you're doing this kundalini from your perineum up to your, you know, pineal and having these experiences. And maybe they'd want to know, right? Is the pineal gland actually responsible for any of this? And throw $5 at it, throw a coffee at it, right? And enough people do that, then you have the ability and freedom to explore that in a sophisticated way. And I think we're perfectly positioned to be able to do that. And it's very exciting work, and I think that everybody attached to it is also you know, has a certain fortitude to have faith and trust in the scientific method over the optics of, you know, even saying that you want to do pineal gland research on a recorded podcast, right? I have a higher fidelity to the scientific process and trust in that than I do about some preconceived notions that people may have with a dearth of evidence, right?
Yeah, it seems like you've done that once before, I thought, in terms of earlier work.
Yeah.
Leo, Felix, any comments?
Half of why we're doing half of why we're doing the study is that we share in the skepticism. We share both like the openness and interest, and we share in the skepticism. I've both of those sides in me of like, part of me is like, what if? And then part of me is just like, let's just get some data on the table and shut up the hippies. You know, like I have both of those voices, and I think both those types of people should be interested in funding this type of research, because we're going to do the experiment in a careful enough way that the data will mean something. It's sufficiently powered, it's sufficiently well controlled that the data we get is going to say something pretty, not conclusive, but certainly informative on either side of that equation. And if worst case scenario, you know, maybe we find out a new cure for insomnia, but or maybe people, you know, have a transcendental trip, and that's part of the way we can help facilitate that. I don't know. Let's find out, right?
Insomnia or longevity, because there's also data on calcification in the pineal gland.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, and I would say, just from my outside perspective, you know, regardless of all the specifics and this, that, or the other, we just, as a human species, probably, if we have people that are interested in learning more about our pineal gland, then we should just let them go and learn about it and tell us what we find out, or, you know, share with what they learn. Yeah. Well, again, just keeping an eye on the time, I think what we can do is put a natural close here to this incredible week of awesomeness that is the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies and the work that you guys are doing. Thank you again for your time. You guys you want to take 1 minute if you do, and have any last closing thoughts that you'd like to share? And if not, that's no problem.
Yeah, just quickly, something to think about is that there's more computing power in a smartphone, like tremendously more computing power in the smartphone than in the computers that were used to send, you know, a rocket to the moon. So it's interesting that people are not leveraging that computer power to better understand themselves or the natural world, and that instead we're like drawn to things like, you know, TikTok or social media.
Yeah.
And I think it's, you know, when discussing all of these issues, like topics of like citizen science and, you know, thinking about the involvement of the public in the scientific process, in many ways, the instruments that kept people decades ago to produce rigorous science are now available to everybody, but nobody seems to be really interested. So you know, when talking about this sort of cultural shift, I think, you know, the question really starts like today and right now, like, why are you not using your computer, your smartphone to run experiments that like decades ago would be impossible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of work to shift thinking there for sure. Leon, did you have? I'm sorry. I thought I heard either you, Nicco, or Leo. I thought I heard someone start to say something. You just want to give space for that. No.
No,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I agree with Felix. Yeah, it's it's again a symptom of this kind of capitalism run amok, where we're using these smartphones, and a lot of development and time, money, and energy has gone towards just maximizing engagement, right? If you do any type of web development or marketing, like eyeballs are dollars, right? It's a direct translation. Like it's easy to draw the curve to advertising dollars and an ROI, et cetera. And I think Leo has said this very well, especially with some of his work with some of his collaborators at USC. It's like, well, we're maximizing for engagement, but like, what about maximizing for positive engagement, right? For things that are actually beneficial and enriching for individuals and collective humanity, right? Like I'm of the opinion that that would actually be the most capitalistic thing you could truly do, right? It's just not it's not a linear process as much as, translating eyeballs to dollars. So yeah, something to consider. And yeah, again, like going back to the, it's out there already, right? Like even the abundance of humanity is already out there. We've done gone made it, it's just really about a distribution and a reprioritization. And they kind of say, someone said it in the chat as well, but I love it. It's like science progresses one funeral at a time. I forget who originally said that.
Oh, wow.
But I think that the three, all of us on this call and everybody who's of this mind remotely, no matter where they are part of that next cultural revolution. And I think we just need to hold the line and ride the wave and be the wave, and just keep the course and be the change we want to see, right?
There you go.
Absolutely. 100%.
Cool. Well, again, guys, it's always a pleasure. Thank you. And there's an after chat. Stan has put the link into the chat. So after chat Zoom call. So I wanted to remind people of that as an option. And again, thank you to Humanity Rising for allowing us to be here for this past week, and to all of the listeners who've taken the time to listen to the things that we've been discussing. And so we appreciate your attention. And if you would, please consider donating to IACS or sharing maybe some of these concepts about the importance of consciousness study in an independent science framework. Tell all your friends. So anyway, thank you guys. And we will talk to you later. Take care.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
See ya.
Carson.
Thanks, Kai.